Good morning. Can you hear me? I'm Herb Heathcote. I'm the Cedars treasurer. As a Cedars board member, I welcome you. I have two announcements today. Many people have indicated that they are ready to sing on Sundays. So today we will start by singing while wearing masks. The ushers will have masks available for those who need them. So if at the start of a song you need a mask, raise your hand and the usher will bring you a mask. Second announcement is that we will be celebrating Earth Day by meeting on Sunday, April 24th from 9:30 to 1 at Rotary Park on Weaver Street on Bainbridge Island. So that's 3 weeks from today. We're not going to meet here in Webster Hall, but we will be meeting at the Rotary Park, which is on Weaver Street on Bainbridge Island. And we'll start at 9:30 for a short service, and then that's followed by a service project sponsored by the Bainbridge Island Parks Department. So that includes a multi-generational event. We'll be planting wildflowers, pulling weeds, dancing to live music, eating local food from food vendors, enjoying creative activities, and viewing the bridge paid for and built by Cedars members at Owens Playground. So 3 weeks from today, we're going to be meeting at the Rotary Park for our service and then a service project. Thank you. Welcome.
Good morning. And welcome to Cedars Unitarian Universalist Church. My name is Gregory Cook, and I am pleased to be serving as worship associate this morning alongside our minister, the Reverend Zachary Vinson. I still have my mask. I've had to start attending to personal grooming more that I take it off sometimes now. Thanks to the sound team and the tech team for making this service available to all of us in this room and outside in the wider community on the interwebby thingy. Also, thanks to the setup team, who seems to be a very small group of people these days, because I continue to see the same people. Maybe that team needs to be bigger. Before we move further into the service, let us pause to acknowledge that members of our congregation occupy the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Coast Salish tribes. The homelands of the Suquamish, Duwamish, Klallam, and Chimicum peoples were ceded under duress through the Point Elliott and Point No Point treaties. We affirm Indigenous sovereignty, both past and present. This acknowledgement does not substitute for the need to build authentic relationships with modern-day members of these tribes and to learn about their living culture and history. Cedars is committed to being a welcoming and inclusive community. In all the beauties of languages, cultures, and skin tones that make up your uniqueness, we welcome you. In all the ways you experience and express gender, in the beauty of who and how you love, we welcome you. With all the religious and ethical traditions that inform your spiritual life, we welcome you. You are invited to join us today and always with an open mind, a loving heart, and willing hands. Now let us prepare for the service by listening to the prelude, Morning Mist, by Dennis Alexander, performed by our very own Audrey Blair.
Good morning. For our call to worship this morning, I would like to share one of my all-time favorite poems by one of my all-time favorite poets, John Ashbery. The poem is titled, How to Continue. Oh, there once was a woman, and she kept a shop, selling trinkets to tourists not far from a dock, who came to see what life could be far back on the island. And it was always a party there, always different, but very nice, new friends to give you advice, or fall in love with, which is nice. And each grew so perfectly from the other, it was a marvel of poetry and irony. And in this unsafe quarter, much was scary and dirty, but no one seemed to mind very much. The parties went on from house to house. There were friends and lovers galore all around the store. There was moonshine in winter and starshine in summer, and everyone was happy to have discovered what they discovered. And then one day, the ship sailed away. There were no more dreamers, just sleepers in heavy attitudes on the dock, moving as if they knew how. Among the trinkets and the souvenirs, the random shops of modern furniture. And a gale came and said, "It's time to take all of you away, from the tops of the trees to the little houses on the paths, so startled." And when it became time to go, they none of them would leave without the other. For they said, "We are all one here. And if one of us goes, the other will not go." And the people all got up to go and looked back on love. And so as we come together this morning, may this time be a time that we can look at and look back to in days ahead and remember that we are all one and that we are connected by love. As Herb mentioned, today we are foraying back into congregational singing. So this is the first time, other than our Christmas Eve service at Fay Bainbridge Park, that we are going to be joining together in song in almost 2 years. As a reminder, though, as part of our COVID precautions, we are asking folks as we sing to please put a mask on. The science says that singing is still a risky activity, and I know many of us are eager to get back to it, but we're also trying to prevent being a hotbed of infection. And so I'd like to invite you now to please put your mask on as we prepare to sing our opening hymn together, number 389 in our gray hymnal, Gathered Here, and Archer and Audrey will lead us.
I'll let everyone find it. Gathered here in the mystery of the hour, gathered here in one strong body, gathered here in the struggle and the power, the Spirit's drawing near. Gathered here in the mystery of the hour, gathered here in one strong body, gathered here in the struggle and the power, the Spirit draw near. Gathered here in the mystery of the hour, gathered here in one strong body, gathered here in the struggle and the power, Spirit's draw near. Thank you.
When I was about 8 years old, My favorite poem was by Shel Silverstein. I don't recall the title, but it goes like this. If you're a bird, be an early bird and catch a worm for your breakfast plate. If you're a bird, be an early bird, but if you're a worm, sleep late. Looking back, I wonder what meaning the author intended. For while I once thought that the entire purpose was to say something funny about a worm, I now wonder, maybe critiquing the idiomatic wisdom of the ancients is the purpose. Or perhaps a commentary on how one's views of the good life can depend on one's perspective. Maybe it doesn't matter what meaning the author intended. If I have a thought or an idea when I'm reading a poem, is the experience less meaningful? Or is the thought less important simply because the author meant something else? Perhaps even saying the meaning is misunderstanding the nature of poetry. And meaning only occurs in that intersection between the reader and the words. When I read Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken, in high school, I arrived at that end bit where it says, 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and I took the road less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. And at the time, I thought, I took the road less traveled. All the sheeple were taking the popular path. Now, ages and ages hence, when I read that poem, I see that the rest of it emanates regret. And the poem isn't called The Road Less Traveled. The poem is called The Road Not Taken. And now I have a different thought. 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and I, having incomplete information, made an arbitrary decision, and that has made all of the difference. I'm really quite sure that if I went to poetry school and studied, I would discover that my interpretation of if you're a worm, sleep late is entirely wrong. 20th century poet Alan Dugan has a poem called Love Song, I and Thou, which starts off, nothing is plumb level or square. The studs are bowed, the joists are shaky by nature, and no piece fits any other piece without a gap or pinch. And bent nails dance all over the surfacing like maggots. By Christ, I am no carpenter. I built the roof for myself, the walls for myself, the floors for myself, and got hung up in it myself. I danced with a purple thumb at this housewarming, drunk with my prime rage. Oh, I spat rage's nails into the frame-up of my work. It held. It settled, plumb, level, solid, square, and true for that one great moment. Then it screamed and went on through, skewing as wrong the other way. God damned it. This is hell. But I planned it. I sought it. I nailed it. And I will live in it until it kills me. Now, I know what this poem means. This guy building a life. But he's no carpenter, no better or worse than the rest of us. He's building a life, and it's not going very well. The results are questionable. I know this. I just wonder if I'll know the same thing 10 years from now. I dedicate the lighting of our flaming chalice to the mercurial nature of poetry. Please join with me in repeating our affirmation. As we come together to worship, we remind ourselves to treat all people kindly, because we are one family, to take good care of the earth, because it is our home, and to live lives full of love and goodness, because that is how we will all become the best that we can be.
I loved it. Just as I was standing up, I heard a little ding of someone's phone. I love it. Perfect timing. Perfect timing. This is the point in our service where we join together in spiritual practice. So I'd like to invite you, however you feel most comfortable, to let yourself feel supported by the chair, by the ground underneath you. Maybe put your feet on the ground, your hands in your lap, and take a deep breath with me. Noticing the sounds in this room, the feeling of the air against our skin as we come into the presence of one another, in the presence of this community. Please join me in a spirit of prayer. Spirit of life, words fail to fully capture the joys and sorrows that our hearts are capable of feeling. And yet, even in failing, we still seek to find the words to communicate, to connect with one another, to feel that we are not alone in this world. Let us feel that connection in this time. Though the words cannot express all of those things we carry, let us know we carry them together, that none of us is alone in this world, in this life. May we help each other to make sense of those things that are chaotic, those crazy-making things that throw us off balance. When that happens, may we be there for each other, to lean on each other and support each other. Spirit of life, remind us of the beauty that is around us and help us to be part of that beauty ourselves in the way that we move, the way that we act in the world, in our relationships with one another and ourselves. In this time, may we feel the love that we share, both this day and in all the days ahead. Amen.
As you might know, Cedars is sustained by gifts from members and friends. We would not be able to continue gathering here as one strong body without the support of each of you. As we take up our collection today, let the spirit of great generosity draw near. If you are visiting for the first time, please feel free to let the baskets pass you by. You are our guest, and we are happy simply that you are with us. Will the ushers come forward to collect the offering? Thank you for your gifts.
Wait, this podium feels a little rickety today. I'm kind of get my sea legs up here. Let's see. Oop, there it is. So I'm curious, have you ever encountered a work of art, literature, or music that the first time you encountered it, you just felt like it was familiar, that it was known to you, or somehow expressed something that was deep inside of you? An encounter that for some reason seemed to cause your being to vibrate in recognition of what you were beholding. Maybe it was a time you were at a museum and saw a painting or a sculpture that caused your heart to just sing out. Or maybe it was a song that came on the radio one day, and when you heard it, you couldn't help but just feel yourself starting to maybe wiggle and stir and dance a little. Or maybe, like me, it was a book or a poem that you read and found a character that you just particularly related to for some reason. Have you ever had an experience like that? I have. I had an experience like this in probably about 2008 while listening to a podcast. I was working in someone's yard, the same someone I mentioned in my gardening sermon last Sunday, removing some plastic weed barrier and replacing it with some new weed cloth. It was a laborious work. It was partly under mulch, and part of this weed barrier was under a rockery, which meant all these river rocks had to be moved. It wasn't easy, but this meant it was a great opportunity to listen to a podcast or two. And at the time, and to this day, one of my go-to podcasts is a podcast put out by the Poetry Foundation called Poetry Off the Shelf. It's a weekly podcast that the Poetry Foundation puts out that usually is an interview with a poet or readings of various poems that a poet chooses to read and some discussion that follows it. I love that podcast. I listen to it still regularly, and I've found some of my favorite poets by listening to this podcast. I oftentimes find myself finishing an episode and immediately going online to buy whatever book of poetry they were just talking about. This particular episode, though, included an interview and a reading from a poet that I had never heard of at the time, a poet named John Ashbery. Since then, I have learned that John Ashbery is considered to be one of the greatest American poets of the 20th and some even say the early 21st century. He died in 2017, so he continued to write almost up until his death. I'll be honest though, in this podcast, I don't really remember a whole lot about the interview that Ashbery gave or what he talked about in terms of inspiration for his poetry, or really any of the other poems that he shared. But near the end of this interview, he shared one poem titled How to Continue. It's the poem that I shared as our call to worship earlier. Hearing this poem felt silly and also as if something in the center of my being was seen. I couldn't explain it then. And to this day, I'm still not entirely sure what about this particular poem really struck me. But I do know that I was moved by it. It felt as if I was hearing someone put words to experiences that I never knew that I had had. It's a strange experience of somehow these words are describing things that don't relate to my life. The details of what's happening in the poem aren't entirely clear either. And yet, despite this, I found myself replaying this same clip of that podcast again and again and again, listening to the poem, How to Continue. Oh, there once was a woman, and she kept a shop, selling trinkets to tourists not far from a dock, who came to see what life could be far back on the island. Maybe it sounds relatable now, being here on the island. But this poem, for whatever reason, it really struck me. And afterwards, I immediately went and bought a collection of John Ashbery's poems, and was a little depressed to find out that this poem wasn't actually in the collection. He was quite a prolific writer, and so when it came time to begin compiling his collected works, the American Library decided in their publication to split it into 2 volumes. The second volume had not been released at this point, and the first volume that I had did not contain the poem How to Continue. Still, I took advantage of this new book of poetry and began reading it. And despite finding many other poems of John Ashbery's that I connected with, I still found my mind going back enamored to this one poem. So much so that I went on the Poetry Foundation website and found the text of the poem, printed it out, and stuck it inside the front cover of the book of poems that didn't include this particular poem. It became this point of almost, I would say, whimsical obsession, where I was trying to understand why. Why did it hit me this way? I learned that this particular poem was written by Ashbery after a trip to visit Ireland, where he was staying with some friends. On the trip, he said that he had an amusing interaction with a shopkeeper in this touristy part of town. So it was such an interesting interaction that it inspired him to write this poem, which he says is about friendship and love, as well as other things. The details of the narrative completely elude me. There's not a clear sense of who the speaker is. It comes from this perspective of we. I know that there was a party and there's revelry and people are going from house to house and there's relationships that are forming and breaking up. But beyond that, we're not really sure why all these things are happening. All we know is that suddenly, one day, the ship sailed away, and in its wake was left a depressing scene. We never quite know what this really means, metaphorically, or why this image. Or why did the ship sail away in the first place? And why did it leave such a destitute state following its departure? Was it a cruise ship, or perhaps a ferry taking the last of the tourists home after the end of a season? Was it a cargo ship departing, sailing, signaling the collapse of an industry or an era? We never know. Despite this poem being my entry point into my appreciation of John Ashbery's poetry, I have since learned that this, despite all of its enigmatic nature, may be one of Ashbery's most accessible poems. Many critics have noted how dense his poems are, and they have been since he first started publishing poetry. In 1956, Ashbery submitted his first collection of poems for publication. This collection was titled Some Trees. In addition to submitting it for publication, he also submitted the manuscript to the Yale Young Poets Contest, for which he won first place. The contest was judged by noted poet W.H. Auden, who admitted that while the poetry in this collection was excellent, he had, quote, hardly understood a single line of it. But it wasn't just Auden who found Ashbery's poems so complex, complicated, convoluted at times. In an interview near the end of his life, Ashbery said this about his own work. He said, "I often wonder if I'm suffering from some mental dysfunction because of how weird and baffling my poetry seems to so many people and sometimes to me too. As a poet, John Ashbery was most closely associated with the movement of poets known as the New York School of Poets. This was a group of poets, and there was also a contingent of painters in the New York School who lived in New York City in the 1950s and 60s. This style of poetry is marked by currents of modernism, surrealism, and abstract expressionism. By its nature, it is kind of a little bit dense and heady. Other poets associated with the New York School of Poetry are Barbara Guest, James Schuller, Kenneth Koch, and Frank O'Hara, all of whom were close friends, and some of whom considered John Ashbery to be a mentor. Even though he was one of the principal poets identified with this movement, it is said that by many that he frequently seemed as a tradition unto himself. I have often wondered if the denseness of Ashbery's poems was a feature born out of his own life. Since the first time I encountered this poet on that podcast I mentioned, I have learned a bit more about him. As a young child, he was one of those kids who loved the arts. He thought he was going to go to school to become a painter and was known for spending days out in the fields with a brush in hand, watercoloring landscapes or painting architectural features of buildings. He was also known for his intellect and love of words. He won several spelling bees, including a state spelling bee in New York State. In the 1940s, he was selected to compete in a Quiz Kid competition. It was a sort of trivia game where kids competed against each other to show who's the smartest. Think of like Jeopardy or something like that. And in this competition, he ended up winning first place. Despite all the accolades he earned for his talent and intellect, there was part of John's life that he was unable to share with anyone else. Anyone but just a few close friends. It was a secret that he kept until weeks before moving away to start college at Harvard. That's when his mom found a letter left unsealed on his bedside table while he was out. Finding the letter sparked John's mother's curiosity, and she read it. In the letter, in intimate and bawdy details, Ashbery writes, he describes his attractions to his classmate, Phil Van Dusen. The letter was not received well by Ashbery's mother. In his biography, it is said that she was hysterical after reading this letter. She screamed, she yelled. Eventually, the emotions did settle down. She tried to talk John out of going to Harvard anyway. She said there'd be too many temptations moving away. Maybe he should stay home for a while longer. Eventually, she relented and agreed it was best for him to go to college. But she did make him swear that he would never tell his father. And so for years, John kept the secret. I wonder what impact the pressure of hiding his sexuality in this way put on him. Did this sort of secrecy and hiddenness impact his poems? Is this why his poems feel so cryptic? It's not uncommon for him to play with, in his poems, for Ashbery to play with perspective and pronouns. At first, this can feel very confusing. And when asked about this, at times, Ashbery said it was because the pronouns that were being used were referencing people he was dating. He might avoid gendering them altogether or misgender them so people would assume that it was a woman. The few times where mentions of his gay relationships did come into his poetry, they were often, like most of his poetry, very cryptic, a mention of a name, a slight passing. One of the things also about John Ashbery's style of poetry is how open it is to interpretation and perspective. In an interview that I listened to, Ashbery was asked about that poem, How to Continue, and what it was actually about. He refused to answer the question directly at first. And then the interviewer asked, many people have always said that this poem is about the AIDS crisis. Is this poem about the AIDS crisis? To which Ashbery responded, I hadn't intended it to be so, but I guess it is. This way of reading his poems, this openness, is something that John Ashbery encouraged. It's this sort of open interpretation to his poems that I think actually makes him so fascinating. It's what fascinates me. One line can mean many things, and within it there's still hidden a secret. Each poem feels like a conversation in which I bring just as much content as Ashbery himself. There are a lot of his poems for me to explore. There are a lot of conversations to have. In a 2017 New York Times article published after John Ashbery's death, Davy Orr and Anita Smith wrote, some poets resemble oysters, taking years to yield a single pearl. But Mr. Ashbery was more like a fountain. He produced 28 individual collections of poetry, and his poem ranged from a handful of lines to more than 200 pages. Despite the prolific nature of John Ashbery's body of work, his poems are not easily accessible. In that way, perhaps his poems themselves are like oysters, collections of words that require prying and effort before yielding up their pearl. In closing, there is one lesson that I hope you will take away from this reflection on the work and life of John Ashbery, and that is this. There is a profound desire for self-expression that sits at the center of our beings. Even in situations that might cause us shame or embarrassment, if found out, we still want to be able to express what we are going through. If I'm honest, I think this is what I was picking up on all those years ago when I first encountered the poem, How to Continue. I think that there was something hidden in the lines of this poem that spoke to something in me. Perhaps it was my own closeted status at the time. Or maybe it was something deeper that I still haven't named. Something about the power of love, even when the world around you is chaotic or scary. A reminder that even in those places, those dark places, we do not journey alone. And when it became time to go, none of them would leave without the other. For they said, we are all one here. And if one of us goes, the other will not go. And the wind whispered it to the stars, and the people all got up to go and looked back on love. To the glory of life. I'd like to invite
All right. 1069. Ancient mother, I hear you calling. Ancient Very good. Thank you all.
Please repeat after me as I extinguish our flaming chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth. The warmth of community or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Our service has ended, but our service to the world and one another begins anew. As we go forth, may we be able to look back on this time and each other with love. May it be so.